What is up, boys and girls? Welcome to week 13 of the Absolutely Epic Early Week podcast. I am podcasting from my old roommate's house, visiting my in-laws and dealing with some hopefully good internet. We'll see how this goes. But that's the potentially bad news. Good news is I'm hanging out with a couple of my good buddies here. Talking some reflection on week 12 and talking week 13. Sorry if I sound a bit disjointed. I have on like big headphones that cover my ears and I couldn't hear myself think. So I just took one ear off and feel more like a human being now. So with all that said, Bobby Fi, how you doing, buddy?
Thank God for NBA basketball is all I can say, because I've been getting a lot of the right plays. Just all of my lineups just get blown up by two or three guys who I felt so sure about, and happens every week. This week it was Rawls and Wilson all over the place, and I had Gabriel everywhere, but I just can't seem to get it going football wise the last 5 or 6 weeks.
Man, I'll tell you what, I had Brandon Cooks on my team this week.
I did too. Oh, he was on your big team. That's
yeah,
tough.
It was. I thought he was a great pivot off of Edelman at the same price. I realized I didn't really get on to Cooks until Saturday night, maybe, and it was one of those realizations where, hey, all of us are talking about what a great play, how Willie Snead has the toughest matchup on the Saints, and Cooks and Michael Thomas are in a great spot, and it was like, wait, we're all talking about this, and then nobody's really talking about using him. So I felt great about the move. Clearly, felt less good about it as the day went on. So
I think it was. I mean, it's weird. If you just would have seen the score, you probably would have thought you were golden.
Oh yeah. And actually, I moved on to Breeze and Cooks at the same time, and was like, okay, I'm going to use these two, and then eventually moved off of Breeze, but stuck with Cooks. So that was a bummer, but it is what it is. And moving on to this week, it's going to be a really, really good week. I like this week a lot.
Me too.
We're going to bring in our third buddy, Grant Neefer. Let's go ahead and spell out his Twitter again if you want to see him get into online drinking competitions and whatnot. It is GNEIFFER07. Grant, I'm going to throw it over you for Week 12's Grant's Rant. Week 13's Grant's Rant.
Oh, man, Jim. As you know, I'm getting deep in this Harry Potter book stuff. Halfway through book 6, and oh man, I don't understand why anyone really reads these books or watches these movies. I don't see anything interesting except for the most interesting thing in the world, which is, man, who's Harry going to hook up with? I have no idea. Luna she's my real underdog there. I'm not really sure what happened, but Ginny Weasley's coming in fast, so who knows what's going to happen. But I don't understand why no one plays the Chargers. Segue. Every single week, they're incredibly low owned, and every single week I tell people to, and no one listens to me because I'm not that smart. But play the Chargers from now on. They're always low owned. They always have upside, and they're always just in high scoring, close games. That play them this week and play the Chargers defense every week of the season in cash and GPPs.
I nearly played Tyrell Williams this last week and didn't because of the matchup, but I thought about you as I was strongly considering it. What do you think, Grant? This week, Tampa and San Diego, are we going to see the typically low San Diego ownership?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, even so, it helps that Seattle had a just dismal performance last week. People are going to think that, oh, the Lions going to get torn apart in San Diego with that makeshift line they have. But it really doesn't matter. Even though Phil throws a shot, but he can get the ball out pretty quick. And it doesn't matter who they're playing. It's just always good. Plus, it's in San Diego, so that helps. Tampa Bay is obviously quite a bit better at home, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. And for anybody who may be a big Harry Potter fan and who may be slightly offended by Grant saying he doesn't know why anybody reads the books or watches the movies, I will point out that Grant texts me about 3 or 4 times a week with updates on where he's at in the Harry Potter books and the crazy stuff going on. So I'm pretty sure that Grant was just trying to throw you off the scent by acting like nobody should be reading these books. Is that pretty accurate, Grant?
Oh, I razzed them real good. Don't you worry.
With that, we're going to dive into Week 13. talking about some trends from week 12 and whether or not we think that these will continue, whether or not we think we can, play off of these on our own lineups. So we're going to start with one that bothers me quite a bit. And I guess I have a little rant myself, and that is Andy Reid. I just don't get him. When he was with the Eagles, he would have a few guys that he would just give the ball to all game. Westbrook was that guy for a long time. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but, he used to be comfortable giving a running back 25 carries. But if you look at, ever since he got to the Chiefs, Jamal Charles has been a 16 to 18 carry a game guy. Rarely goes over that. This year, Spencer Ware, they're always holding him under 20 touches. Tyreek Hill, 2 weeks ago I rostered him because he's a tremendous player and they should just get the ball in his hands. And then, he had, I think, 10 fantasy points. It was quite a bummer. And this last week, I think he had one target heading into toward the end of the fourth quarter. Then all of a sudden, racks up 10 targets by the end of the game because the Chiefs decided they wanted to win. So I don't understand how the Chiefs use Tyreek Hill or why they use him the way they use him. So my question, and Bobby, I'm going to start with you first on this one, is Tyreek Hill's usage. He had, 10 targets this last week. He had a rushing touchdown. But we've also seen Andy Reid's offenses really de-emphasize elite playmakers. So Tyreek Hill's usage, do you think it's a trend or is it a trap heading into a positive matchup against Atlanta this week?
I think it has to be a trend. It's a great matchup against Atlanta. He's done the off and on again pretty much every other week, and then he had back-to-back good games. But for the most part, he gets targets, and he's always going to be returning kicks too. So he got another touchdown that way this weekend. I think he was the first guy since 1985 to have a kickoff return, a receiving and a rushing touchdown. But yeah, I think that I definitely think it's a trend. I'm all about him. I think that they need to get him involved more in general, especially with no Macklin. And I think they will. I think they're going to have to this week in Atlanta. I think that's going to be, it's a really good game to target.
My struggle with these things is it's like the Rashad Jennings thing last week. I eventually got onto him and obviously wish I hadn't. But during the first half of the week, I kept saying, Ben McAdoo has this history of not giving one guy the ball, and it's annoying and it doesn't make sense to us. But, then 2 weeks of Jennings or a week and a half of Jennings getting all the work, we think, okay, well, finally McAdoo has figured this out, and then he comes out and rotates series the entire game with Paul Perkins. Do you have any concern, Bobby, about that happening? I mean about Andy Reid just – because I agree with you. Like, they have to get him the ball. It makes sense. But then Andy Reid just seems to not do what makes sense a lot. Do you have any concerns that that'll be the case?
Yeah, I do. And I think that I totally agree about Andy Reid. It's really hard to figure him out. But I think that it's this last week was a little bit different. Like, they were playing a tight game that they weren't really doing a whole lot through the air. It was a weird game. And then of course it was when they were forced to throw the ball a lot, they that's when he got all the targets. And if you look at the pattern of his big games, I mean, for the most part, it's the low scoring tight ones where they've been trying to run the ball, even though, like you said, they didn't run the ball all that much with Ware this week. I think he had 16 or 18 carries. I can't remember. But if you look at the targets that Hill's had, against at Carolina, who their secondary obviously has just been beaten up badly this year. At Denver is a tough one because you wouldn't have known it going in, but you have a high scoring game that sort of, they needed the activity late. Basically, when they're forced to throw the ball at these times without Macklin, I can't see how he's not going to be, in the 8 to 10 target range this week, but yeah, I am a little bit worried about Reid.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, as far as with Atlanta probably certainly putting up some good points at home against this Kansas City defense that is better now with Justin Houston back, but still has a lot of holes in it. Grant, what's your take on the Tyreek Hill situation? Are you concerned that his usage is going to drop back down, or do you think this is something we can target?
Well, like they always say, a walrus can't change his spots, and Andy Reid looks like a walrus, and he gets set in his ways of doing things. But I mean, we saw, 2 years ago when he decided not to throw a touchdown to anyone but a tight end or running back the entire season. It's one of those things where he kind of gets in a groove of what he likes and then he just does it. And I think that he's going to continue to do this with Hill. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if Macklin's out, they got to throw the ball to someone, and they don't really have many other receiving options besides Kelsey, of course, which he should see a huge amount of workload and targets week in and week out for the rest of the season. I was seemingly the only guy on him this last week, and it worked out great. But it's one of those things where Alex Smith, he's more of a game manager. He doesn't throw a lot of long bombs. He's just basically high completion percentage throws. I mean, we saw it in San Francisco when Harbaugh was there. He had one of those games where he completed almost every single pass, and he consistently has a high completion percentage, I think. And so I think that they're just going to do a lot of essentially what the Rams do with Tavon Austin in the offense, which he's Tavon Austin, and that's a terrible offense, so it's a little bit different. But they're going to try and get the ball into Hill's hands. I mean, we saw it this week. 10 targets, 9 receptions with only 52 yards, but he gets a rush every single week. He's involved in the receiving or the return game. He'll be heavily involved in the offense, I think, for the rest of the season. I mean, I'm a little bit worried when Macklin comes back, but they're kind of different wide receivers. So I could see him just more as a possession guy the rest of the season and getting high amount of targets, which would be great for PPR leagues.
Yeah, I mean, if he's getting the ball in his hands, then I want him on my team, especially weeks he'll be lower owned. The question obviously is whether or not he will get those touches. I'll definitely be keeping an eye this week. I think it's a spot where if ownership's going to be really high, I mean, you know, Grant, you said the numbers yourself, whatever, he had 50 something yards. He's just not, they don't throw downfield to him a ton. So I don't think that you have to have him if he's shaping up to be a high owned guy this week. But on weeks when he'll be low owned, I do think that he has explosion potential anytime he's taking the field, especially something like on the turf in Atlanta, which should only help him. And if he's going to be low owned this week, he'll be a phenomenal play, I think. So the next thing I want to talk about is something near and dear to mine and Bobby's heart at the moment after the Brandon Cooks fiasco, and that is the Saints wide receiver usage. Now, the Saints are playing at home again against the Lions. This last week was basically the perfect time to target the Saints because the Rams do have a good defense, but obviously the Saints at the Superdome doesn't matter. Then they went out and had a huge game, and obviously everybody's going to swing toward the Saints this week. I don't think people are going to overlook the Saints at home against the Lions. But one thing that probably will happen is Brandon Cooks should have pretty low ownership. Michael Thomas should have pretty high ownership. And obviously Michael Thomas is the number one guy on this team, but it's very much, you know, if you look at the targets, I think it's very much a 1A, 1B thing. And you could even say Cooks is still the number one guy. But my question is, Bobby, do you think that, or did I say I was going to go to Grant first? I don't remember. We'll go to Bobby. Bobby, do you think that the usage here is that it's like swung too far away from Cooks for us to use him this week if he's going to be lower owned, or do you think that's just a 1 week blip last week?
Yeah, I think you should get used to it when you watch the Saints play like a lot, and it's been true the whole time that Breeze has been there. There isn't, I mean, other than Colston, they'll have, and even him, he had weeks where he had one catch where Breeze would throw 5 touchdowns, even at his best. This is just sort of the way he does things. It's like a little bit the Aaron Rodgers thing. If you have a really good quarterback that's really good at going through their reads, you're going to have days where if they're paying too much attention to somebody else, they're not going to go off. I'm going to use Cooks the same way I always do. This doesn't change my opinion at all, except for that his ownership will be lower. And he'll be in a good portion of my tournaments as of right now, because I don't think that it's something that's going to completely go away. I think Michael Thomas is for real. I've been saying that all year long, and I thought he could end up being their best receiver by the end of the year, and I thought that was kind of bold. Now it's actually happening. But I don't think there's any reason to get away from Cooks. He still has big playability. He can have 5 targets. He's got the Sammy Watkins deal. He can have 5 targets and end up with 30 fantasy points because he has 2 touchdowns that are 60 yards. I mean, it's always a good time to play Cooks when he's going to be really low owned at a reasonable price. And I'm not going to go away from it. Although I think it's something to look at. It's not something that it's pretty much fits the Saints pattern throughout the time Drew Brees has been there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I really think that this is a great week to target Cooks, and I think that there'll be enough talk about him being a sneaky play that he'll probably still rise up to about 10% ownership. But 10% ownership for one of the top 2 receivers in a game that could see another 50 points is still a pretty good deal. Grant, what's your take on this situation? And I'm also going to ask you an additional question, and that is, what is your take on the Saints tight ends? Because obviously it's a great matchup against Detroit. Is this a week where we can expect Fleener and Hill to both be heavily involved again, or do we think it's going to be one or the other, or neither? Like, how are you looking at this game early in the week?
So in terms of Cooks, yeah, Bobby probably was pretty much right on the nose with it. I mean, we've seen 2 catches of over 80 yards so far this season from Cooks. Like, it can happen a big play at any given time, and I think the Rams game was just more of a crazy game. I mean, they were blowing people out. I were blowing the Rams out. It was a weird type of game because I didn't expect – the Rams had given up like 6 points, 8 points a game the last 3 games prior to this, and then obviously all this happened. But Cooks, he's one of those guys where he's not the type of guy that I think you should be playing as a one lineup guy where you want a guaranteed like 10 points from a guy and then a high ceiling on top of it. And he's just not that guy. He's more of a big field GVP guy. Like, he can easily be the top scoring wide receiver, or he can easily be the worst wide receiver on the entire Saints offense. So I think that's how you should view it. Like, don't play him in smaller tournaments, or cash especially, but play him in big field GPPs. And as for Cooks and Hill, I don't have the numbers in front of me, or Fleener and Hill, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Hill had a good amount of targets this last week. And so I think that he'll be heavily involved, and the Saints like to spread the ball around. So it's going to be one of those games where you don't know exactly where it's going to go. There's probably enough points to go around, but Thomas really is like Colston was in the offense. I mean, they're similar sizes, they're similar players, and I think Thomas is the only real sure thing. We've seen Fleener, we've seen Hill, we've seen Ingram, we've seen Hightower, all of them have big games. So it's kind of treating it how you treat the Patriots offense, where you have one player that's essentially guaranteed touches and guaranteed yards and points every single week. And the Patriots is Gronk, and the Saints it's Thomas. And that's pretty much how you have to treat it.
Yeah, and on the thing with Cooks, and I agree with you completely that it's kind of like, I don't think we can prognosticate with 100% accuracy where the ball is going to go on this team, because, like Bobby was saying, Breeze will go through his reads and he'll hit the open man. With Cooks, I do kind of think that there's a chance that this week, a strong chance that this week, they make a concerted effort to get him involved, that they go somewhat out of their way to get him involved because of having 0 targets last week. So I do think he's not just a high ceiling play this week, but a pretty safe play as well. Also, on Thanksgiving slate, it's a 3-game slate, and I put up 170 points with a 0 from Eric Ebron. And that's with only 3 games available and a couple bad offenses. And I bring that up because I think a lot of people forget that you can load up on a couple games, even if you're just doing, 1 or 2 or 3 teams. Like, you could take 5 guys from this Saints-Lions game and then fill out, the other 4 spots from 1 or 2 other games and put up 200 points easily, because this is the sort of game where you're guaranteed a lot of points, and if you can cap most of those points, you're in great shape, in any field, in cash games and tournaments and whatever, because there is going to be a lot of fantasy goodness to go around in this one. Next guy I want to talk about is Bobby, somebody you mentioned, and that is Sammy Watkins. So this last week he played under 50% of the snaps, but he played more than I was expecting him to play, largely out of necessity for the Bills. But the Bills are in heavy contention for a playoff spot. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about, and it all boils down to how you think Sammy Watkins will get used this week. And Grant, I'll start with you on this one. But with Sammy Watkins, there's a few things. There's, the Bills are the run heaviest team in football. The Bills are playing a Raiders offense that is going to put up points and force them to get aggressive. We have Sammy Watkins' health. We have the big Raiders corners who have gotten burned by, I almost used Ted Ginn in cash games this last week. True story, just because those faster receivers do so well against the Raiders, and these bigger guys always seem to struggle. So Sammy Watkins fits the Kelvin Benjamin mold of a guy who would have a much tougher game against the big Raiders corners. So just with all these things going into the pot together, going into the cauldron, if you will, Grant, how would you see this coming? I mean, Sammy Watkins is cheap this week. So how do you see this playing out this week with Sammy Watkins against the Raiders?
I think he's going to have a huge game. So, I mean, you look back at last year, the second half of the season, Tyrod Taylor was throwing to him most games double-digit targets almost every single time, and they don't really have a lot else to throw to. They can't really play the deep ball as much because they have Shawn Mccoy out of the backfield, and they always have to kind of worry about him. But it's one of those things. I think the Raiders are dead last in the league in terms of sacks, which doesn't really make too much sense with Irving and Aldon Smith there. But, I mean, Tyrod Taylor, he can sling the ball far, and he has a big connection with Watkins. And I think for the most part, the pitch count is going to be limited on Watkins this week, and he's the perfect GBP play. You don't often have guys at 5,500 that can put up 30 points on any given week with some ease. I mean, he had last week, he had a 63-yard reception or something like that, and it could have easily gone for a touchdown. I think he's more in play on sites where it's a half-point PPR, even though, I mean, last year we saw one game against the Jets with him having 11 receptions. But he's generally going to be the downfield threat and the guy that he's going to just be going off for 150 yards or most likely 30. So I think he's still safe enough as a fairly high floor just because of the matchup. But I absolutely love him this week. He's going to be one of my top played wide receivers on the entire slate.
Yeah, I think 50. I could be wrong on this, but if I'm wrong, then I'm close to right. It was, I believe, week 8 last year when Watkins put up a gigantic game against the Dolphins, 30-plus points. And I believe he was exactly 5,500 in that game as well. If he was not 5,500, then he was right in that range. But, yeah, I mean, it's a phenomenal price for a guy who – and that week – I remember some people were concerned about Brent Grimes, the matchup with Brent Grimes, and that was before most people realized that Grimes was no longer as good as he had been, earlier in his career. But, what I said that week was just Sammy Watkins is a guy who should be priced at $7K or above, and the fact that you can get him for 5,500 means that he has to be considered one of the top plays. I'm more concerned about the matchup and the usage than you are, but I do think that they will be throwing more than normal in this game, playing at Oakland. That Oakland offense just puts up points, so definitely a lot to like there. Bobby, what's your take on this Sammy Watkins situation?
Yeah, I'm interested in Watkins this week. I'm interested in what they say about how many snaps he'll play, but I'm not really actually that interested in how many they say he'll play. I think he'll be fine. He was 5K this last week, I think, and I actually put him in some lineups just because that huge play potential is always there. And at that price, look, I'm going to play him. I mean, I'm going to play him a lot in this kind of a matchup. I don't know exactly what percentage of my tournaments that he'll be in, but he's one of the top guys I'm targeting for sure.
All right. So we got 2 more things to cover. And the first one I want to talk about is Carson Palmer can't throw the ball downfield. We all know this. We don't know what happened, but he can't throw the ball downfield anymore. And so most of these targets go to David Johnson and Larry Fitzgerald. So this week they play the Redskins, who have one of the worst run defenses in football. And I was talking about this on Friday night on the round table, but we forget that Bruce Arians got, the week against the 49ers, it totally slipped everybody's mind that Bruce Arians got fired from the Steelers as offensive coordinator. And the rumblings were that he primarily got fired because he was throwing the ball too much and they wanted him to call a more balanced offense. And he still just kept calling such a pass-heavy game plan. Well, that game against the 49ers, they nearly lost because they kept throwing the ball with Carson Palmer. And the thing is, the 49ers are a top 3 defense at defending the short passing game. They're horrible at deep passing. They're horrible against the run. But you got a guy who can't throw downfield, and you're calling on him to throw the ball every play instead of running with the best running back, second best running back, whatever, in football against the worst run defense. Yeah, you're going to struggle. So they're playing the Redskins, all for run defense. We have to keep in mind that doesn't mean David Johnson's going to get 30 carries because Bruce Arians is kind of hard-headed. This is his offense that he runs. He doesn't have a quarterback to do it right now, but whatever. But with how much pass game work David Johnson gets, it kind of all balances out. So this is an interesting discussion because he's 9,500 this week, which is like for a running back, on a PPR site, that's just ludicrous. That's insane. But at the same time, it kind of makes sense. So, Grant, I want to start with you on this one. David Johnson's usage in this offense against the Redskins, is it worth 9,500? I mean, are you comfortable going there this week?
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, so you always think, all right, I don't want to use a running back because he's not – you don't want to pay that much for a running back because they're not going to get as many receptions. But that's proven not to be the point, not to be the case of David Johnson. I mean, you look at the last 6 weeks, 8, 7, 5, 7, 8 receptions, all those. He had over 100 yards out of the receiving game. And it's basically one of those things where he's basically – poor man's LaDainian Tomlinson back in 2005. Like he's a great player and he can do a lot out of the receiving game. Him and Le'Veon Bell are both guys that I think David Johnson, when he was first recruited, was supposed to be a wide receiver, but it was just because of his size that he got switched to a running back. Has one of the highest usage rates, I think, in the entire NFL, if not the highest, because he's used so much in the offense every single play. So it's one of those things where you can expect a minimum of 4 to 5 receptions out of him and 50 receiving yards week in and week out, especially the way they're running this offense right now. So I think that he's absolutely in play. I'm going to play him on almost 100% of my lineups. I had him in 100% of my lineups this last week. And it's one thing where you don't often have a guy that, especially on DK, can get both the receiving and rushing 100-yard bonus and get 8 receptions there.
On top of that, he also has it might have changed, from last week to this week. I haven't looked yet, but basically he and Melvin Gordon are 1 and 2 in carries inside the 20, inside the 10, and inside the 5. So he gets enormous red zone usage as well. It's not like you're just hoping he busts something long. He's getting vultured down there. He's always getting the looks down there as well. Bobby, what's your take on David Johnson at this enormous price tag?
Most weeks I would be all on board with saying that it makes perfect sense to pay up for it. It depends on what you consider value and how you want to build your team. It's hard for me to do this week, to be honest, at that price. And I think that there are other running backs that have really good matchups that are in the 5-6K range that I feel like can come at least close enough in production where I'm not going to go there, but most weeks I would usually say make a spot for it. There's just the way that I've built a bunch of lineups just before this just to try and get it in the swing of it, and I didn't use him much because there's just other spots I can go to, and yeah, he does have the guaranteed production. He's the best player in football. I wrote him up saying that a couple of weeks ago. I just don't think that this is a week where I feel like I need to have him at 9,500. I'm probably going to avoid both him and Le'Veon.
Grant, any return thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's fine. I think it's a terrible call. I mean, I think it's more of a terrible call in cash because you can get guys with huge upsides at multiple spots in the running back at $2.5K cheaper. So it's fine if you're in a GPP, but I think in a cash game format, having a floor of 20, 25 points with a running back is just a great thing to do. It is tough to find value this week, but I think there's a good amount of guys with a pretty nice floor at wide receiver at cheap prices.
Bobby, I mean, you're talking tournaments when you're talking about that anyway, right?
Of course, but I'm mostly thinking from that perspective anyway, but I'm not saying – I don't think he's like a must-have in cash either. I think he's probably a good play, but I don't think it's a must-have. I just don't see it for that price. I really don't.
So for me, my thing is it's what are you sacrificing? I forget somebody wrote something that I read a couple of years ago about roster construction that was basically saying whenever you put somebody on your roster, don't think about it in terms of what you gain by putting in that player, but instead what you lose by putting in that player. As in, if you put in David Johnson, you lose the ability to pay up for other guys or to have a more balanced roster. So I've been with my in-laws all weekend, and then I was out with my best buddy last night. So I've had really very little time to dig into this slate, but it's the sort of thing where if you can fit in guys all around David Johnson who you also feel comfortable can hit 20 points. And then you have David Johnson's 20-point floor with a 30, 33, 35-point ceiling, then you do it. If you're making sacrifices just to fit him in, if you're taking guys that you're saying, okay, I think he can hit 3x and get me 12 points, that's not worth it to get the guy who can get you 30, because instead you could get a couple 6K, 6,500 guys who can get you 20 points apiece with upside, as opposed to somebody that you're hoping for 12 points from. So I think it comes down to a balance there. But yeah, I mean, clearly he's a good play. I'm probably in the middle of you two, and I'll be looking for a way to use him, but probably won't be married to the idea. Grant, any final thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right, and I think the easiest way to do that is, like, if you're trying to figure that out, like, is it really taking me away from too many other good guys, is to do it in pairs of 2s or 3s. So the best way to compare it is, all right, what would I rather have, David Johnson and Eli Rogers, or Taylor Gabriel, or would I take 2 guys that about 6K, 6.5K each? So would I rather have Hyde and Michael Thomas on the same team? You kind of go like, what's the floor, what's the ceiling between those 2 guys, or do 3 guys, and you kind of can figure out, all right, is this a good move? Is this not a good move? Is this a must play? And that's just the easiest way to do it. That's how I generally make my decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great take, and a great way to think about things. As far as, and obviously everybody has different approaches, and I think when I first started playing DFS, not that most of our listeners are noobs, but when I first started playing DFS or writing or whatever, you hear things that somebody you respect says, and then you get it in your head that is the way to do it. Whereas the truth is, there's a lot of different paths to success. There's a lot of different things that work. If that weren't true, we wouldn't have these shows where, different people have different opinions. But for when somebody, Grant's a profitable player, he's a very good DFS player, and when you hear, his approach on how to do roster construction, it's important to listen to that and incorporate those things, I think, into and challenge yourself to say, okay, how can I add that to my approach? Does that work for me? So I like that take a lot, just as far as, the strategy side of things, of how you look at things, Grant. The last thing we want to talk about is the sorry about this one, Bobby, but the Seattle offense. And so, Bobby, I'm going to go to you. I'm assuming you watched a good chunk of the games that you had Russ and Baldwin, or Russ and Rawls.
Yep.
What happened this last week? And they play Carolina this next week. So is that just a 1-week blip? I mean, they return home. They get to play in Seattle against an improving but still bad pass defense. Real quick, something to think about. A big reason the Panthers' pass defense started improving was because their pass rush started improving, which obviously didn't matter as much against Oakland's elite offensive line, but does matter against Seattle's horrid offensive line. So are you jumping back on Seattle? I mean, do you think that this was just a weird 1-week blip, or are you kind of lukewarm on them this week?
I mean, we've seen this from them before. We've seen it this season. That line is so bad, but they're also going to, then the next week they come out and Wilson puts up 30 fantasy points. I don't know. I can't say for sure exactly what goes on in these kinds of games, but it's not like they haven't been doing this for the last 3 years. They'll have games like this. This year they've had more of them than they usually have. They had the Rams game earlier, the Arizona game. Now, those are pretty good defense, especially with Arizona, but there's really no excuse for it. But I also don't feel like it's a trend going forward that they're going to just be, you can't take them. I think that now is another time to buy low on them. They're not going to, I don't necessarily love them this week. There's other spots I'd rather go, although I think it's a decent matchup. They tend to play pretty close, low scoring games with Carolina, with the exception of the playoff game, of course, which was a shootout and made me a lot of money. But anyway, I don't think that I would steer away from them. I think that this is just something that happens with them from time to time, and yet you got to live with it. You're going to have those duds, but at the same time, when they pay off huge.
Yeah, I almost feel like some stuff with Russell Wilson is just so illogical sometimes. We can't just look at numbers and say, oh, this is what is what. And so looking on paper, you probably don't want to get too excited about Russ against Carolina because of Carolina's pass rush and the way that's help them improve their pass defense and how bad the Seattle line is. But then again, it's Russell Wilson. And for all we know, he's going to throw for 400 yards and rush for another 50 or something crazy like that. I do think, early week take, but I do think that this is a GPP spot and not a cash spot. I don't think that this is a place that I would feel comfortable saying, yeah, I'm going to load up on Seattle guys
Definitely
in
not.
cash games, which shouldn't, if this had been a month ago and you were saying Carolina at Seattle, we would all feel comfortable going there in cash games. Or I guess if you said healthy Russ and then those factors, but I don't think it's just recency bias to say this isn't a cash game spot. I mean, this last week, sure, didn't go well, but it's not even about this last week for me. It's about just the matchup against Carolina's pass rush. But I do think it's a great GPP spot. Grant, what's your take on our thoughts on this and your thoughts on this?
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. Yeah, it worries me a lot this week. I think Carolina is second in the league in terms of sacks. And that does worry me. But, I mean, I watched pretty much the entire game. I'm a huge Seahawks fan. And you look at it, one of the biggest problems was drops by all the wide receivers throughout the course of the game. Jimmy Graham even had just a terrible drop. I think Lockett had 2 or 3. I think Curse had 2. It was just an all-around awful-looking game. Like, it's one of those things where I don't expect this to continue. It was on the road, and Seattle's a much, much easier to play at home. So it definitely gives a huge upgrade there. And one thing that we overlook is that Russell Wilson had 80 yards rushing in this last game. His legs are back, so that gives him a whole lot of upside in terms of adding a bunch of points on there in the rushing offense. Going against Carolina, I'm really not too worried. Tom Cable's a great offensive line coach, and generally when things go horribly, horribly wrong with the offensive line, the next week they come back and they seem to have it together. So, I mean, it's one of those things where we saw them multiple years ago just destroy everyone, lose at home against the Rams, destroy everyone, at home, everyone, have a terrible, terrible, no good loss. And we've seen crazy games. And one thing that they always seem to do is they are always in a game. This is their worst loss of the season by I think 8 points, which they haven't lost by more than 5 in their other 2 losses. And they obviously tied against Arizona, which they could have won at any given time. They're going to keep the game close, and I think there's going to be higher scoring because Cam Newton's going against the Seattle defense, but the defense is still injured. I'm not sure if Bennett's coming back this week. Earl Thomas will still be out there. They're injured in the secondary, and they're injured all over the place pretty much. So I think that this is a week. I can still trust him in cash. I have no problem with that. And I think that you can trust him in GPPs. I think he's one of the best plays of the entire week. And I think Baldwin's going to have a real big week because he can't quite trust Lockett or Curse as much as he wants to. And even Graham, he's starting to go downhill a little bit. He'll rebound, but I mean, it was just a perfect storm of terribleness this last week.
Okay, so we're going to move on to there was a long, lazy pause there because I felt like I should have said something in response to that, but then nothing came to mind. So we're going to move on to Love at First Sight, where each of us picks out a game that stands out to us. Before I throw it over to Grant for his Love at First Sight story, I want to point out that last week, I didn't look, but somebody texted me to say I believe there were only 10 teams in the Millie Maker with a score higher than 200. Well, last week there were only 2 games on the entire slate with an over-under above 46.5. And that was one of those games was Atlanta and Arizona where, people want to load up on the Cardinals, but do you really want to load up on the Cardinals with Carson Palmer at quarterback? So there was just not a ton to choose from last week. This week, we got Kansas City and Atlanta has an over-under of 49. Detroit, New Orleans, 53.5. Buffalo and Oakland 49.5, Tampa and San Diego 47.5, Washington, Arizona 49.5, New York and Pittsburgh 49.5. So basically there's a lot to like this week from a high scoring perspective. And so, yeah, I think this is a good week to really focus on a few of these high scoring games, just load up on them and maybe even find the high scoring games like Grant talked about earlier with San Diego, the high scoring games that other people won't be on because if one game's projected at 53 points and one's projected at 50, that's not a big gap. And you can get a lot of fantasy goodness that other people aren't getting by going to the slightly lower projected game. So Grant, I'm going to throw it to you for your love at first sight story, and I think I have a feeling on what your game will be, but let's hear it.
So first, let me say what you said. One thing that you really have to look about last week is the reason why the scores weren't over 200 has largely to do with the fact that Breeze and Kaepernick were the two main quarterbacks that really went off, and they were not that chalky, especially Kaepernick. And then there were more tight ends that went up for goose eggs last week than I've really ever seen before. And the highest scoring chalky tight end was Delaney Walker with 14 points. So you're not going to see a whole lot of high scores with most of the tight ends putting up goose eggs, but I think that's going to change quite a bit this week. I didn't really come up with the love at first sight. I forgot about it. So this one time I went to a bar, talked to this lady, and she tried to get me and my 3 roommates back to my place to have fun because she wanted options. And it really confused me. And that's the end of my story. It feels good to have options. Buffalo. Now that Sammy Watkins is back, I bet you didn't think this was going to be my game of the week, Jam.
No,
now that Sammy
I didn't see the story coming. I didn't see you're the most prepared person on this podcast too, so I didn't see the being unprepared, and I didn't see Buffalo being the game of the week. So you're full of surprises on this glorious Tuesday.
Yeah. So Buffalo. I mean, Taylor's going up against the offense. I know that both of you guys think the Oakland Raiders defense is good, which they may very well be, but this is going to be a high-scoring game. I mean, Oakland can put up a bunch of points at any given time. They are going against a team where their cornerbacks are generally pretty good, so I think that means that Cooper is going to be used less because anytime he's going up against a good cornerback, he has a worse game. But it's one of those spots where they don't get that much pressure on the quarterback, and Tyrod Taylor can run, so he can put up a bunch of yards running. And if he has some time to throw, he can throw the ball deep to Watkins. They're going to have Shawn McCoy, who's a drastically underrated player, I feel like, every single week for DFS purposes. I mean, it may be largely because he's only going to get like 20 carries at most, which they seem to hold true to every single week. But he is $2K less than David Johnson and like $1,500 less than Le'Veon Bell. It's one of those things where he's drastically underpriced from the top tier, even though he really is a top tier guy in terms of upside and half the time in terms of floor. So that's going to be an incredible game to have in a week that doesn't have a whole lot of value. And also Oakland, I really like Seth Roberts this week. I can't remember what his price is, but I can imagine that's low.
That is an interesting game, and it's again, it's a 49.5 over-under, and so it's one of these things where it's only about 3 points lower than the one in New Orleans as far as Vegas implied projections go, and it's a game that people are going to overlook. I don't think that people are going to look at that game and say, oh, that's a game I should avoid, but it just doesn't stand out as a game that you want to dive onto. I mean, we still have things ingrained in our heads from years of the Bills being a defense-driven team and the Raiders being bad. And we all know those things aren't true anymore, but people still don't just swing toward heavy ownership in those spots. So, Bobby, what's your take on that game, and what is your the game that's standing out to you the most to start out the week?
I thought that it was a good take. I agree with everything except for the Seth Roberts thing. I'll never play Seth Roberts in a lineup just because I'm never going to take a guy who gets 4 targets every week. But I do agree that that's a good sneaky game. I think it will go overlooked, and I think there's a lot of potential there. I still think that Buffalo's defense. I think both defenses are a little better than they've shown, but they have the tendency to play these high-scoring games. So I keep getting proven wrong a little bit about that. But there's talent on both defensive sides, so it's not where I'm going. But I do think it's a great place to go off the board. But as far as my game of the week, maybe mine's a little more chalky. I decided not to do the New Orleans one just because that seemed too obvious. But I really like the Kansas City Atlanta game, which is pretty obvious too. I think that you could take any number of players. I actually have a lineup where I have Spencer Ware. I don't know if I'm going to actually keep this, but it's because it's kind of ridiculous. But I have Spencer Ware, Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, and Alex Smith. And then along with Julio Jones and Taylor Gabriel, in case it really gets crazy out there. And I'm telling you, I've seen lineups like that, a couple times last year with Pittsburgh, that won the Millionaire Maker. And sometimes it takes something like that. So, but I think it's a great game. It's it's a spot where there's really nothing. The only person I'm not interested in really is probably Freeman, but I would play pretty much everybody else in this game, especially on the Chiefs side of the ball. I really like it. It's definitely an upgrade for them playing that Atlanta D in the Dome. And Atlanta, we know what they can do offensively. So that's the game I'm looking at right now, that really jumped out at me to start with. But you can't go wrong with a lot of the other ones this week.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I like the full game stack idea, and I think that's something that really goes overlooked as a strategy. I'm gonna probably say for all of us that the Detroit New Orleans game is clearly also one of the top games to target. And as I said earlier, to just load up, take 5 or 6 guys, because there's a lot of fantasy goodness in that game with 2 bad defenses and 2 really good offenses. But since neither of you did it, which might be the first time all year that this has happened, I'm going to cover for you guys and say San Diego and Tampa, because you guys are supposed to be my love for San Diego offense boys. So I'll take that one. And this is what Vegas Sharps would classify as a letdown spot for Tampa, and traveling cross country. It's not an easy thing to do, to come off a couple big wins. I mean, at Arrowhead, at home against Seattle, and then travel across the country to take on a team with a losing record. So I have a lot of faith in Dirk Cutter. I think he's a great coach. I think that there's a chance that he has Tampa, the players ready to play, but just psychologically, it's a good spot for the Tampa defense to let down a little bit, and for the San Diego offense to do what they've been doing all season, which is just going nuts. So against this Tampa pass defense that coming into last week at least ranked 30th or 31st in yards per pass attempt allowed, they give up a lot of big plays, and so it's a good spot for Phillip Rivers. It's a good spot for his downfield receivers. Tyrell Williams had a little bit of injury scare, but seems that he is going to be fine this week. So Tyrell Williams is basically the nuts this week as far as looking for places to target where you have that 30-point upside and aren't going to have 30% ownership. So obviously that is a game that you guys like, because you guys always like that game. So I am now going to transition us to Money Matters and try to hit some of these low-priced guys. I also just remembered we have some punishment to dole out, which I forgot to do at the beginning of the show. And so we'll get to that after this as well. But I want to just this week, each of us pick out just one guy at each position who's standing out to us in terms of value. And I'll go first at quarterback. And I'll go above 6K and just say Colin Kaepernick at 6,100. And I don't like Kaepernick, but it's just this game against Chicago is probably going to be ugly. But Kaepernick's usable right now every week in tournaments, just because we saw this last week, what his ceiling is, and his floor is 18 points, and at this price that's pretty good. So Kaepernick's not a good quarterback, but he is going to take off and run when he gets flushed out of the pocket. He is improving as a passer at this point. So Kaepernick's the guy who's standing out to me at quarterback. Grant, who's the guy at quarterback who's standing out to you at the lower end of the price range?
Tyrod Taylor. We already went through this. I already gave you my full spiel, but he's a guy that actually has a pretty high floor because of his rushing yards. And people are going to look and see the last 2 weeks of 160 yards passing and not realize that he should be up over 200 now with Watkins in there, and he has potential 3 touchdown upside. So I'm going with Tyrod Taylor. Or if you want to regret things, go Ryan Fitzpatrick, who I also love.
I like the Tyrod Taylor call. I skipped over him to leave him for you. So, Bobby, who are you seeing now that we've left you with the scraps at quarterback?
No, I don't think you did. Actually, my favorite player under 6K is, or lower end, is Andy Dalton. I'm sorry, not Andy Dalton. No, wait. No, sorry, Alex Smith.
It's wow, Andy Dalton, let's get bold.
I get those two guys mixed. I always get their names mixed up or something. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's that they're both not. They both should be much better than they actually are. But I just love the spot for Alex Smith playing in Atlanta there with his new weapon, Hill and Kelsey, and it's just I think he's in a great spot this week. I think he's actually the highest projected quarterback under 6K on all the projection systems I've looked at so far. So he's the guy who I would go with.
I like it. Next up is running back, and I'm going to kick things off again and just say Dion Lewis against the Rams. And I just think that Dion Lewis is, I mean, it is obviously a tournament-only play, but his usage is just going to keep increasing. He had 7 targets this last week, 5 targets the week before. He had 6 carries this last week, 5 carries the week before. And when this guy gets in the open field, he's lethal, and he's probably going to be 3% owned. And we saw last year, he has 25 to 30 point upside. Definitely not a guy you want to use in cash games, but at 3,800, and he had basically 8 points and 10 points his first 2 weeks back from the ACL tear. So I think he's a guy that we could see, before the end of the season, have one of his 25 or 30 point games, and that makes him a good tournament salary saver in my mind. So, Bobby, who are you seeing at running back that you feel comfortable saving some cash on?
I like that call, but you're cheating because that's your team, so you know them better. No, I like that call a lot. I really like Jeremy Hill. It's not an ideal matchup or anything, but with him getting all the work, it didn't really play out the right way this last week against a really, really, really good run D in Baltimore. But I think that now, the fact that he had six receptions this last week for 61 yards, and he's taken over sort of the Geo role too, in addition to having his old role of just pounding the ball. So at 4,300, he's just mispriced. He hasn't had a game to prove it yet, but it's going to happen, and I'm not going to be the one to miss it. I've been on him at all the right times except for this last week, but it wasn't even that bad of a game that he put up, and he's only 4,300. He's an excellent play to me. I think he's probably my favorite one under 5K. I don't know if there's anybody else who jumped out at me quite to that level. I thought James Starks was a good play too.
Yeah, I hate that that the matchup's tough again, but obviously that will keep ownership lower. I didn't think that he was going to get as much pass game work as he got, but getting that type of work makes him extremely valuable. Grant, who are you seeing that in this cheaper range, one guy that you feel really comfortable saving some salary on?
First of all, Dion Lewis, I'm not sure about him this week. I think they're not going to be passing him nearly as much as they were last time. The game's projected to be a blowout, and there's not that many times where a blowout Brady's going to end up with 50 passes. So I'm not sure about him. It's definitely worth a tournament flyer, but I don't see his floor that high. Bobby, you still mind with Jeremy Hill, who I said would get 15 points this last week and did. Boom. There's my boom. This is not really under 5K, but I'm going with either Carlos Hyde or Devontae Booker. They're both 5'3" and 5'1", but Booker had 24 rushes this last week, and Hyde always has a huge upside, especially this is a game where I think is actually going to be San Francisco winning, which they'll be running the ball a lot.
Yeah, that's fair. I like those calls. And this is kind of one of those weeks where we may not end up under 5K. I think Tim Hightower is also interesting just in that he keeps getting usage. He'll probably get 15 touches against Detroit. Mark Ingram has looked better than Hightower, that is. But Hightower still keeps getting usage, so that makes him valuable in what should be a high-scoring game. One quick note, actually, on that Detroit and New Orleans game, and I don't want to overstate this as far as making a bigger deal out of it than it is, but plays per game, I'm pretty sure that the Lions play at the third slowest pace, and then they run the second fewest plays per game. And let me check opponent plays per game real quickly. Detroit allows the sixth fewest opponent plays per game. So that is an interesting thing to think about that I hadn't thought about as we were talking about that game earlier, just that people don't realize that Detroit is actually a slow-paced offense this year, which has not been the case in the past. And that definitely makes a difference in what we can expect for total plays for the Saints. So just something to think about there, and probably lowers the volume on somebody like Tim Hightower from what it would be if you were playing a fast-paced team. So moving on to wide receiver, Grant, I'm going to throw it to you first for a wide receiver that, not necessarily under 5K, but just somebody that you feel comfortable saving salary on in order to pay up in other spots.
So I really want to say Seth Roberts. He's minimum price at 3K. It's one of those things where Amari Cooper generally has a much worse game going up against a good cornerback. And Crabtree, I mean, Buffalo's got two decent quarterbacks. You look at the target rate and the receptions per game to the third string wide receiver for them. I mean, it's high for the tight end and it's high for the third string wide receiver. And so it's one of those things where at 3K, Bobby, you said you're not expecting more than 3 targets out of him, but he's averaging over the last 6 weeks 5.5 targets per game. He has 5 touchdowns on the season. So out of a 3K guy, if he just falls into the end zone and gets 3 receptions for 40 yards, then that's already going to pay off his price. I mean, that's 15 points right there for a minimum price guy in a week in which there's David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell on the board. You can fit those guys into your lineup, both of them, if you have Seth Roberts on your team. But there's a lot of good price guys. I'm going to name 2. Marquez Wilson. Anyone who saw the game saw all those drops that Barkley sadly had, and he seems to trust Wilson. Even Cutler did too. And the guy's still only 4K with 12 targets this last week.
Yeah, I like that call. Bobby, who are you seeing to save salary on?
Yeah, I still think Seth Roberts is a lunatic idea in this week. There's too much value out there. You can Hill is a great option. I agree with Wilson, but I actually think Meredith is the better play in that game, especially because the lower ownership. He did get 9 targets and I think had 4 in the end zone. At least just because they didn't complete them. A couple were drops, but he, there's no reason why to jump off him. Especially you're going to have him and Wilson basically at the same price. One's going to have 10 times the ownership or 50 times the ownership the other one does. And I'm going to take the guy who's the bigger, better receiver. So I like Wilson. I like him a lot. Meredith. I like who else did I see on there? I think that Marvin Jones is a really interesting play at New Orleans. He finally got his targets back up last week. They have had trouble, especially with whether you call him the 1 or 2 receiver, whatever it is. They have trouble with all receivers, so it's fine. But I love him in this spot. I think people will gravitate towards Tate more and Riddick, and I think that he's in the spot where he can really light these guys up. This is his kind of a matchup, and he hasn't really had one of those in a long time. And this is maybe the game where he gets healthy again after getting. I think I said he had 9 targets. He had 11 targets this week. So I think Marvin Jones is one of the best plays on the board.
Yeah, I think that wide receiver. There are a lot of guys under 5K, and it was funny. A buddy was talking to me, maybe a month ago, and it was a week when I had 3 running backs on my roster, and he said it's funny. A year ago, we all would have thought that was a dumb move to have 3 running backs, but this year, the NFL as a whole has gravitated back toward more 3-down backs. And so for a couple of years, it was dumb in DFS to pay up for running back because you could get the same production for 5K that you could get for 8K. Now all of a sudden we have all these guys, Zeke and Bell and David Johnson, who are so heavily involved in all aspects of the game that you can get guaranteed points up there. And then if you can find these guys below 5K at wide receiver who can go off, it really helps out a lot. So Marvin Jones is one of my favorites there with the 11 targets. First time since week 2 he's had 11 targets. And Will Fuller is another guy. I hate Brock Osweiler, but against Green Bay, in a game that you expect Houston to have to be aggressive to keep up, it's a good spot for Will Fuller. So Grant, you got your mic off because you got some final thoughts there?
I just want to say for cash games this year on DraftKings or especially Fantasy Draft, I mean, my biggest strategy over the last month has been using David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, Zeke Elliott, and one other running back that's guaranteed to get a high amount of usage. You have such a high floor from just those 4 guys. It's almost 80 points. And if you just throw in any of these huge value plays at wide receiver, then you have a chance for just an absolute massive floor on your cash games. And I've been cashing almost every single week, and I have generally 4 variations of my cash game lineup. At least 70% is cashed every single week in the last month. And it's just one of those things where if you pay up for a running back, I think it's a much better move than going with all these high-priced wide receivers. They're guaranteed targets because the targets are going to be coming for half these running backs anyways. Yeah,
no, and it's just crazy because a year ago that would have been the opposite of what we would have been looking to do, just because especially on a PPR site, those targets for wide receivers are so much more valuable than the carries for the running backs. We have some unique dynamics with Zeke Elliott being he doesn't get a ton of pass game work, but being so good and being behind that offensive line that on a team that's so committed to the run. And then add in David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell with their pass game work and their talent. and their goal line usage, and being on the field 90+% of the snaps. And you all of a sudden have, at least 3 guys who are all better high price plays than the high price wide receivers. Definitely an interesting situation that we've run into with things, kind of the landscape kind of changing in that way this year. So definitely like those people who have shifted sooner than others are benefiting, and those who continue to shift sooner than others throughout the rest of the year will benefit. So tight end, where we always have some value, I'm going to go ahead and say, I don't know, Eric Ebron against the Saints at 3,900, which isn't really cheap for a tight end, but is still a cheap player. Ebron is coming off a goose egg. I might have the all goose egg team. I'll throw Ebron and Brandon Cooks in there and hope that things swing back their way. But Ebron's usage has been really high throughout the season, and I think it'll go back up this week. I think he's a strong play against New Orleans team that's weak against the tight end. So, Bobby, who's one tight end that you're seeing?
I actually like Ebron too, but I was thinking about Fedorovich. I think people will be off of him because he kind of had a letdown week, but he still gets a ton of targets, and Green Bay's been terrible against the tight end. So I think Fedorovich should be a logical play.
Yeah, I was going to say him, except that I've always said Fedorovich, and now I've been hearing people say Fedorovich.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, well, I don't want to say his name out loud because what if I'm wrong? So skip over him and go to Ebron. But yeah, Fedorovich is how I've heard it, before, and then all of a sudden everybody's saying it the other way. So who knows? We'll call him up and find out how he wants us to say his name. Grant, tight end, who are you seeing?
So this is, you guys aren't going to expect this, but Jermaine Gresham, he had 10 targets this last week, and he's slowly been seeing more targets. Like, he didn't have many in the first 6-8 weeks of the season, but then it's a tough play, but he's at minimum price at 2,500 and had a lot of targets this last week. One thing that people need to realize, Palmer can't throw the ball very far down the field, so he's checking down to Fitzgerald, to Gresham, or to David Johnson almost every single time. And once they actually get into the red zone, he has a touchdown in both the last 2 weeks. And it's one of those things where I think he's going to basically be Dennis Pitta, but he's going to have touchdown upside. And at 2,500, if you can get 10, 12 points out of your tight end, which is reasonable, and because I think he's going to have touchdowns multiple weeks of the last few weeks of the season, because they don't really have many other people to go to in the end zone. I mean, Fitzgerald, I think, has 2 touchdowns on the year so far. And so all the other guys don't really seem like huge red zone threats. It's basically David Johnson, check down to David Johnson, or I think Gresham's going to be the other guy that Palmer's starting to trust and that he should be using, especially going up against a Washington team with Norman on the outside, locking people down, and an actual decent pass D that's not the greatest in the world versus the tight end.
That is a really interesting take, and I like it a lot. It's Bruce Arians' offense and Bill O'Brien's offense do not emphasize the tight end at all, which took me longer to buy into Fedorovich than others because, or maybe not others, but took me a little longer than I would have liked, just because I'm like, okay, they don't call plays to the tight end in this offense, but Brock Osweiler feels so uncomfortable throwing outside the numbers that he keeps throwing to the tight end anyway. And we're starting to see that, Gresham has always been used as just primarily a blocking tight end going back to Cincinnati. That was his specialty even there. And if I remember correctly, he was drafted above Rob Gronkowski, which is humorous. But yeah, so he is getting this dump off usage from Carson Palmer, just because, Carson Palmer is uncomfortable throwing down the field right now. So definitely something interesting to think about there. So I have a question before we dole out punishment. Do either of you guys have any firm, bold calls that you want to that you are ready to throw out there? Because I'm wondering if we take a week off of bold calls, unless you guys have something that you want to throw out there. Bobby, what do you think?
Well, I mean, why we're going to take a week off after I lose?
Well, you'll still have to get your punishment. No week off. I don't know. It's so tough to come up with something on the spot, and then we're gonna lose.
I know.
That's why
we all are in the same spot here, bro.
All right. So let's dole out some punishment. I believe, did I say that the Buccaneers would win last week? Was that my bold call?
Yep.
Did you really?
Yeah, and then I said I didn't actually think it was going to happen, but I thought it would be a close game, and So I felt comfortable with it. And then what? Grant, you said the Browns.
Yep, and good old Bobby got the loss with the Cardinals.
So incredibly, which seemed to be the safest call, that was the team that lost by the most points. So Bobby gets to tweet out something embarrassing this week and cannot give any indication that it's not a real tweet. So, Grant, what do we have for Bobby this week?
So I came up with these after I had my 11th drink last night. So they're kind of nonsensical. The first one, since it is your birthday, it's my birthday, scooty doody doo. I'm a party the whole day through, boogity boogity boo. Hashtag I'm a scat man. Hashtag Quentin Tarantino sucks. The second one is just spank my tush and call me Sir Shirley. I've got a Land Before Time marathon on the way, and if anyone bothers me, there will be hell to pay. And number 3, all I want for my birthday is Star Wars episodes 1 through 3 box set on Blu-ray with full commentary. Hashtag Jar Jar Binks is my beezy. Hashtag Darth Maul life. Hashtag the best 3.
Wow. That's rough. Those are rough, man. It's my birthday. Oh my God. That's crazy. So I would like to eliminate the second one. And what was the first one again? Oh, my birthday. Scooty. Oh my God. This is a rough one. This is a rough one. You guys can pick it and just tell me that I'm not doing it today. I'm doing it tomorrow. I don't want to freak my friends out on my birthday.
Star Wars one is probably the one less likely for people to think it's a real thing.
Wait, which is that one?
All I want for my birthday is Star Wars episode 1 through 3 box set on Blu-ray with full commentary. Hashtag Jar Jar's my beezy. Hashtag Darth Maul life. Hashtag the best 3.
Oh my God. All right. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'll do it.
If there's not enough space to fit all of those words in, Grant, we need to make sure that the hashtag the best 3 stays in because.
Oh, I already checked. Don't you worry.
Oh, you checked. It's good. We're good.
Yeah, he was prepared this time. I could tell. That seems like just at that 140 characters.
Exactly 140. All right, so I'm going to kick off then with a bold call, and I'm going to say that the Saints-Lions game will have at least 5 players who are not quarterbacks who score 20 DraftKings points.
That's bold.
Which would mean you could go quarterback and 5 guys and pick up like a good 130 points right there from your first 6 spots, and then fill out your last 3 from there. So that'll be my bold call. There's
a lot to get.
5 players with 20 points. So I'm giving myself a chance for another Mrs. Buttersworth tweet with that one. So who's ready? Who wants to go first with their bold call?
I'll do it.
Okay, go ahead, Bobby.
I was gonna say that Cam Meredith will have. I thought it'd be against somebody else who would maybe pick the same kind of thing, but I don't know. I think Cam Meredith and Marvin Jones will both be 2 of the top 10 receivers this week overall.
I like it. I was going to say Marvin Jones. I was going to go Marvin Jones for a top 10 wide receiver until I started thinking about Eric Ebron and then thinking, oh, maybe the targets swing back to him this week. Granted, they're going to throw a ton, I'm sure, but I got a little scared off of making Marvin Jones a top 10 guy for my bold call. I think that this will be a week where we'll have to post on Monday and let readers chime in or listeners chime in, in a poll to see who lost, because we'll just have such different types of takes. But I like that one a lot. Grant, what do you have for us?
I'll let you guys pick Seth Roberts for 15 points at 3K, or be more like my boy JM and say that 6 guys from the San Diego Tampa Bay game will go over 15 DraftKings points, or 7 guys will go over 15 DraftKings points.
7 guys.
Defense is included because San Diego defense is going for 15.
Okay, and so defense and quarterbacks included.
Yeah.
7 guys and over 15. And that was in which game? Buffalo and or no, it's Tampa and San Diego.
Yep.
Well, you've already got Mike Evans and Jameis Winston and Phillip Rivers and Melvin Gordon and Tyrell Williams. That's 5 guys guaranteed right there going over 15. So I'm gonna say the Seth Roberts one is more bold.
Done.
Yeah. I don't know if it is.
I mean, so that we just like that's 5 clear guys who are going over 15 points, right? You're including quarterbacks. Then if you get a defense, you just need one more guy to Antonio Gates to hit 15 points or Doug Martin to hit 15 points.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good point.
So I mean, I don't know. Maybe Grant's scared of what we're going to come up with him for him next because of what he's been doing to us lately on the tweets.
Yeah.
But
if you want, I could go Phillip Rivers is going to outscore Drew Brees.
I like that one.
Go with that one.
Go with that one. Now
I could use a loss. It's been a while since I've been the outright loser.
Yeah. So that about wraps it up for us. Bobby, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Just thank goodness for the NBA DFS again.
I'm so sad.
You know why? Because I'm not playing cash games this year as much on and I think it's just killed me because I keep getting all the right plays, but then I'll throw in like a weird one, like a Braxton Miller this week was one of my sleeper plays. And then, there was a bunch of guys who were shut down like Rawls and the whole Seattle team. And I don't know, it's just driving me crazy. But I actually think this is the week I get back on top. But I love NBA DFS better than anything else, I think it's surpassed football for me.
I like this week a lot. I think it's going to be a big week for us. Grant, any final thoughts?
On your wedding day, if you get cold feet, throw your shoes and socks in the microwave and you should be fine.
On that note, I am JM to win. That is Bobby Firestone at Bobby Fi, Grant Neiffer at GNEIFFER07. I am JM to win. And thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you back here, same time, same place next week. And we'll see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.
See ya, kids.